In this election year, we often hear Republicans lambast President Obama and his administration on the basis that the Democrats are threatening to turn the United States of America into Greece. My name is Yanis Varoufakis, and I'm a Greek economist. And I'm here to address you on precisely this question and the broader question of how does one put together a progressive radical agenda against this kind of idiocy. The idiocy that comes both from the Republicans and from the Democrats who are defending the indefensible from the other side of the fence. In 2008, the world we live in changed. Greece was the canary in the mine that died because of methane gas, which came our way following the collapse, the implosion of the financial sector in 2008. Effectively, we experienced in 2008 our generation's 1929. What follows is not at all dissimilar to what happened after 1929. Under President Hoover, the American working class was made to bear the burden of the profligacy of the bankers of the 1920s. The result was that both the bankers and the working class fell into a black hole. In 1929, for the first time in capitalism's history, we encountered a wholesale implosion where even the class struggle became meaningless, in the sense that we didn't have a tug of war where when wages declined, profits increased and vice versa. We had a period during which both profits and wages collapsed. This is very similar to what we had in 2008, with the difference that the powers that be, in particular the Fed, the Bank of England, to some extent the European Central Bank, learned their lesson from 1929, only insofar as ensuring that the bankers would not face the same collapse that the working class did. My country, which is being used as part of a scare campaign here in the United States and elsewhere, is just the canary in the mine that died when the 2008 crisis released the methane gases of recession, ensuring that debt, negative investment and inflation would engulf my nation and then a succession of nations. Now, Goebbels used to say that if you're going to tell a big lie, you might as well found it on many, many small truths. And also, if you take the big truth, reverse it, and keep repeating its reverse again and again and again. We've had this for many, many years, decades. Here in the United States, during a period when working class real wages were being squeezed beyond belief as part of a campaign for enhancing exploitation and expanding inequality, you had the great Goebbelsian lie of the trickle-down effect, the idea that if the rich get taxed less and allowed to keep more of their monies, then some of those riches are going to trickle down towards the poor. In reality, what was going on was a trickle-up effect, not only through the squeezing of wages, but in particular as a result of the fact that the lost wages, the stolen wages of the working class, were being lent to the working class by an expanding financial market, which in cahoots with the developers were creating a bubble both in real estate and in finance. That was part of a global system of keeping capitalism going, not so much as a conspiracy, but something that organically evolved, which is going to go down in history as a very interesting period of human economic global history. It was a period during which the surpluses of the surplus-producing countries, Germany, Japan, later China, were being absorbed in the United States in the form of the trade deficit. And at the same time, to finance that, the surplus value, the profits of capitalists from Germany, from Japan, and later from China, were flooding Wall Street in order to close that circle. That tsunami of capital that was flowing into Wall Street financialization, and boosted the extent to which the subprime mortgage market became, for instance, just one example, the foundation for this alliance between the exploitation inequality of the working class within the United States on the one hand, and financialization that created all those toxic derivatives and the private money that flooded not only the United States but also Europe. As all that capital, financial capital, was being generated on the back of expanding exploitation and inequality in the United States, that money flowed into Ireland, into Spain, into Greece, into southern Italy, seeking what else? Higher returns, riskier projects and riskier loans to be made in order to provide the finances with a slightly greater interest rate. When all this paper, toxic money, burned down in 2008, as was its wont, as was inevitable, then all this capital disappeared and liquidity, money in effect, withdrew violently from countries like Greece, like Ireland, indeed from Nevada, from the subprime markets of the United States, like a vicious tide leaving nothing but mud and destruction in its wake. And this is the crisis we find ourselves in. Austerity is nothing more, just like under Hoover in the 1929-1932 period, than an attempt of the powers that be to shift the burden of this crisis from those who caused it onto those who were its victims before it even happened, to have the workers and the unemployed and the needy pay for it by means of lower wages, higher unemployment, and lower benefits and social security. Greece is a very good example of that. And yes, we are in danger of all becoming Greeks now. From Minnesota and Arizona and California, all the way to Ireland, Spain, Italy, and Greece. Now, it is quite helpful to think of Greece as the subprime market, the subprime belt of Europe, with one difference. Europe is so badly structured that imagine what would have happened in 2008 if in the United States you had a situation whereby the banks of Nevada would have to be saved by the state of Nevada, which did not have access to money printing presses, and then had to borrow this money from the money markets. What would happen is both the state of Nevada and the banks of Nevada would go under. Imagine if the state of New York had to salvage Wall Street by borrowing. Both the state of New York and Wall Street would have gone bankrupt. This is what has happened to Greece, as the first country, and then to the rest. But what is even worse than the disease was the cure that was administered. Not only was austerity meant to shift the burden from the victims of the growth that preceded the crisis to those who brought it about, the finances, but remarkably, the bailouts that you hear so much about in Europe, just like the bailout of the banks here, but even worse in Europe, accomplished an amazing feat in Europe. We hear that the German taxpayer is paying money for covering for the losses of the Greeks, of the Greek government and the Greek people. But nothing could be further from the truth. What has happened is the German banks, just like Wall Street prior to 2008, had overburdened themselves by huge loans to the periphery, to Ireland, to Greece, to Spain. Loans that were insidious, sinister, just like the subprime mortgage loans here in the United States. Now, when those loans exploded as a result of the crisis, and those banks were facing huge losses of insolvency and bankruptcy, what happened was very simple. The German government did not have the guts to go to the German people and say, listen folks, you are going to have to pay for our bank's mistakes. You are going to have to cover their losses. No, what they did was to make the Greek government and the Irish government, the Portuguese government, and so on and so forth, borrow huge amounts of money using German taxpayer collateral, German taxpayer guarantees, effectively German taxpayer money, in order to return it to the German banks. So effectively the German taxpayer was taking on his or her shoulder the losses of the German bankers. But the Germans were never told that. They were told that out of solidarity they were giving a lot of money to the Greeks, when of course the Greeks were getting nothing. All the Greeks were getting was austerity that was squeezing the life out of the Greek economy, making it impossible for Greece to repay the German taxpayer. So what happens when you mislead parliaments, German parliament, the Greek parliament, the Irish parliament, every parliament there was in Europe? And at the same time you tell the German taxpayer that the reason for his or her financial difficulties is that the Greeks are profligate and they're lazy and corrupt. You end up with a great deal of animosity between different peoples. When in reality, the Germans and the Greeks have nothing to distance them, to set them one against the other. It is the German bankers and the Greek bankers that caused the crisis. And it is the German people, working class people, and the Greek working class people that are paying for it. And yet, instead of creating an internationalist coalition against the causes of the crisis, the Greeks again are turning against the Germans, and the Germans are turning against the Greeks. And soon the Greeks are going to be turning against the Greeks and the Germans against the Germans. You can feel that in the United States too. The Tea Party is nothing more than a manifestation of this inability of the working classes of the United States to come face to face with the reality of the crime that was committed against them. So let me now come to some good news. You may have heard that Syriza, a left-wing party that was never heard of outside the strict confines of Greece up until recently, has almost won government in the last election. Syriza was a party of around 3 to 4.5%, an insignificant party in the greater scheme of things, even within Greece. A rainbow coalition that had resulted from the split of the Communist Party in the late 1960s following the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, the splinter group that began the history that led to Syriza were the Eurocommunists who opposed the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and sided with the Prague Spring, that magnificent moment in European history. Later on, in the 1970s and 80s, that splinter group of the Communist Party, Eurocommunists as they were called back then, went into a loose coalition with various ecological organizations, green parties or groups, and also with gay rights activists and various other social movements, very small social movements. Altogether, they've never got more than 3 or 4 or 5%, not because their appeal within Greek society was so small, but because the electoral system, just like here, was putting the onus on progressive voters in the end to choose between the Democrats and the Republicans, the Socialist Party in Greece, which is the equivalent of the Democrats here, and the Conservatives, which are the equivalent of the Republicans. Nevertheless, this crisis that erupted in 2008 worldwide, and which turned Greece into a very interesting case point, example, showcase of what happens when, following a financial sector collapse, a small capitalist economy just goes under, buckles under the pressure, and is not allowed to recover simply because the German bankers need to be bailed out by the German taxpayers without the German taxpayers knowing about it. When this happened, and the Greek elites, who happened to be represented at the time, it was an accident of history, by the Socialist Party, which used to be quite a radical party in the 1970s, but had shed its radicalism in order to become allowed into the corridors of power later on. It was the Socialists who were in government at the time when this crisis erupted. And they were effectively bamboozled by the powers that be, bankers, politicians in Brussels and in Frankfurt and in Berlin, to impose severe austerity and to be the agents of finance capital in Greece, acting against the interest of the Greek people. For 2 years, that socialist government under George Papandreou uh, acted precisely like a Quisling government and squeezed the daylights out of the Greek social economy. The result was that a mighty socialist party of 40 and 45%, that's what they had scored only in 2009, effectively shriveled and withered, and now is a party of less than 10%, and of course out of government. So imagine if the Democrats were to just disappear. And suddenly, the tiny little Syriza left-wing coalition, a rainbow party, without even realizing it, found itself from 3% to have burgeoned to 30% almost in the last election in June. There were two elections, one in May and one in June, becoming the official opposition party and having come very, very close to power. So what are the lessons from this? Well, to turn a rainbow progressive coalition into a party of government, you need a massive collapse of capitalism. You need something like what happened. But this doesn't mean that if a collapse happens, then such a rainbow coalition is going to reach the stage where it can contest government. Because history favors the prepared. Syriza was there. It was a party that was functioning in parliament, a very small representation in parliament, but nevertheless it was there. It had hammered out ways in which the different tendencies within it could coalesce and could coexist, even though they had big disagreements amongst themselves. It was ready. It had not imagined that history would propel it from 3 to 30% in such a short space of time. And over the last few months, Syriza has been working very hard to mature in such a way as to be able to carry this burden that history has placed upon its shoulders. But it was ready. So my message to United States radicals is, we need such a radical coalition to have branches from Hawaii to New York, from Washington State to Texas. We need a presence in this country. We need to find ways of cohabiting, even though we may have differences amongst ourselves and amongst the various tendencies within this rainbow coalition. But we have to have the resolve to do two things, which are not easy. They don't come easily to radicals. The first thing, we have to retain our radicalism at all costs, while at the same time having a pragmatic approach to the moment in history that we find ourselves in. It is quite clear to me that this great crisis that we find ourselves in is the equivalent of 1931 in the United States. Let me remind you, 1931 was not a revolutionary period. When people have difficulty putting food on their table, it is not a time to imagine the good society. It is a time to imagine ways in which social solidarity can produce mitigating effects on the pain that people feel. It's the time to prepare for a new deal, a new deal, which, unlike the FDR New Deal, should nevertheless retain a hard core of radicalism in its center. This is the task. Also, we need the aging revolutionaries to be prepared to give their place on the leadership of this coalition to the younger generation. This is what happened with Syriza. It wasn't easy to convince the aging revolutionaries to sit aside for a moment and allow Alexis Tsipras and the younger generation of Syriza leaders to come through, but it was done and it was very significant. So, let's all be Greeks now, in the sense of allowing for the possibility that a rainbow coalition can be put together, which, when the historical time is right, is going to allow to give rise to a movement that has a real prospect of using power sensibly, democratically, and with good effect for bringing about a good society in the future. Thank you.